A millionaire discovers his pregnant ex-wife cleaning tables at his wedding reception. What he did next shocked everyone. Jonathan Blake stood beneath the ornate crystal chandelier, its prisms refracting flickers of gold across his finely tailored suit. All around him, people mingled and toasted, laughter echoing against the marble floors in a symphony of celebration. The air smelled of roses and exquisite perfume, an aroma he had painstakingly chosen for the biggest day of his life. Tonight was supposed to be perfect. He was marrying Maureen, the epitome of sophistication and grace in a lavish ceremony that showcased his success. He tried to steady his breathing, forcing a confident smile as a photographer snapped photos of him with his new bride. Maureen glided across the floor in a sleek white gown, an elegant, statuesque figure who thrived in the spotlight. She radiated excitement, greeting guests with the poised ease of someone who believed her life was finally complete. Everyone seemed entranced by their union. And why not? This was what Jonathan had always wanted: financial security, social status, and a future that sparkled like the chandelier overhead. Yet something wasn't right. A flicker of unease settled at the base of his spine the moment he heard the faint clink of dishes from behind the curtain where the caterers worked. It was merely background noise in an event so grand, but the urgency in his chest felt like an alarm bell. The thought came, uninvited. What if there's something here that could shatter the illusion of my perfect life? He tried to brush it off as pre-wedding nerves, though the ceremony had already ended. Perhaps it was simply the exhaustion of orchestrating such an extravagant affair. Before we dive into this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's free, as your support helps us create more meaningful stories for you. Enjoy the story. Then he saw her. It happened in the blur of celebration. One moment, he was shaking hands with a business associate. The next, his gaze drifted across the ballroom. And there she stood, her face partly hidden by a server's cap, smoothing the tablecloth with unsteady hands. His heart seized. The years of separation vanished in an instant. Even beneath the modest uniform and the shadow of exhaustion across her features, Jonathan recognized the woman who had once been his entire world. Lillian. The name erupted in his mind like a flare. He had not seen her in so long that he'd convinced himself he no longer cared, yet the mere sight of her sent a tremor through his core. He forgot to breathe. A bouquet of emotions collided in his chest. Guilt, nostalgia, and something too raw to name. Why was his ex-wife here, at his wedding? And why was she clearly pregnant? His eyes locked on the curve of her belly. There was no mistaking it. She was carrying a child, far along by the looks of it. Waves of memory crashed over him. Their whirlwind romance, the nights when they dreamed of building an empire together, and the bitter fights over his unrelenting ambition. She had once believed in him so fiercely, believed he could conquer the world, and he had, in a way. The proof was this very wedding, a testament to his wealth and status. But at what cost? An icy sweat formed at his temples. He glanced at Maureen, who was laughing in conversation with a group of well-wishers, entirely unaware of the emotional earthquake raging inside him. He couldn't let her see him falter. If she noticed him staring across the ballroom at a pregnant server, the entire night would unravel. So he plastered on the same polite smile he'd worn for countless business deals and turned away. But he couldn't unsee what he had seen. Like a magnet, his gaze kept flicking back, drawn to the quiet figure he once loved with every fiber of his being. Lillian paused to hand a champagne flute to a guest. In that moment, their eyes met. Dark, familiar eyes that flashed with recognition and shock. The tray in her hand wobbled. Her lips parted as though she might speak, but no sound came. Jonathan's chest tightened with panic and longing in equal measure. Then, as swiftly as it began, she spun around and disappeared into the sea of guests, lost among tuxedos and glittering gowns. For several heartbeats, he stood motionless, as if the world had frozen around him. He barely heard the music or felt Moren's delicate hand slip into his arm. Everything else in the ballroom faded to insignificance. "Jonathan," Moren murmured, her voice a gentle reminder that he was the star of this lavish night. "Are you all right? You look pale." He forced a laugh that sounded hollow to his own ears. "I'm fine," he lied, turning to face her with a reassuring nod. "Just overwhelmed by how perfect this all is." Her smile blossomed. "I understand," she replied, pressing a light kiss to his cheek. "It's a big day. Let's enjoy it." As Moren's attention drifted to another guest, Jonathan allowed a single shaky exhale to escape. He knew it was only a matter of time before he made an excuse to slip away and confirm with his own eyes that he hadn't imagined Lillian's presence. A part of him hoped he had hallucinated, that his mind was playing tricks out of sheer exhaustion. But the knot in his stomach told him otherwise. And so, amidst the laughter and the champagne toasts, he put on a performance worthy of any socialite. He thanked guests for coming, accepted congratulations with polite detachment, and even managed to dance briefly with his bride. Yet his mind raced with questions he had no immediate answers for. Why is she working at my wedding? How could she be pregnant? Am I the father? He swallowed a lump in his throat. That last thought rattled him to the core. He recalled their final argument, the harsh words that severed their bond. She had disappeared from his life, and though he pretended to move on, a wound remained, one he'd buried beneath success and new relationships. But now it bled fresh. Each second felt like a countdown to a confrontation he both dreaded and needed. In the next hour, Jonathan searched the massive reception hall for any sign of her. The staff bustled in white shirts and black vests, but Lillian was nowhere to be found. Each passing moment made him feel more on edge, as though he were balancing on a narrow ledge, one breath away from plummeting. His heart thundered in his chest. Finally, he paused by a gilded pillar, scanning the crowded space once more. She has to be here, somewhere. Yet the only glimpses he caught were of guests swirling on the dance floor. No Lillian. His shoulders sagged in frustration. Could she have left already? A sudden wave of dread coursed through him. Maybe she had fled for good. Maybe he had lost his only chance to find out the truth. His eyes darted to Moren, radiant in her wedding finery, now sipping champagne and laughing. Next to her, a table full of VIP guests beckoned him over with smiles. There was no easy way out of this. He had to face Lillian eventually, but how could he do it without shattering his new bride's illusions? He pressed his palm over his chest as though trying to contain the storm brewing there. One thing was certain. His flawless world had just begun to crack, and if he didn't find a way to confront Lillian, that crack would only grow wider, threatening to devour everything he had worked so hard to build. Yet how do you confront the past, he wondered silently, when it appears at the happiest moment of your life, carrying a secret that could change everything? Jonathan cast one more desperate glance across the reception hall. Little did he know, the moment he would finally find Lillian again was just minutes away, and it would set in motion a series of revelations that would uproot his life forever. A soft melody drifted through the grand hall, but Jonathan hardly noticed the music. He slipped away from the crowd, weaving between circular tables draped with satin cloth. His heart thumped as he scanned the faces of the servers moving among the guests. He needed to find Lillian again. She was somewhere in this building. He could feel it like a pulse in the air. A burst of laughter rang out behind him, and he instinctively ducked into a side corridor to avoid more questions from curious guests. Guilt pressed on his shoulders like a heavy weight. This is supposed to be my wedding night, he thought, and yet all I can think about is Lillian. In the hallway, the music faded to a distant hum. The lights were dim, casting long shadows on the polished floor. He finally spotted her near a service elevator. She looked exhausted, her brown eyes rimmed with shadows. Her hair was pinned back in a simple bun, and her uniform stretched around her belly in a way that made his chest tighten with concern. She glanced up, saw him, and froze. For a moment, neither moved. "Lillian," Jonathan said, voice trembling despite his best effort to sound calm. "Please, I just want to talk." She let out a long breath as if summoning patience. Then she pushed the elevator button. "What is there to talk about?" she asked in a hushed tone. "You have your new life, Jonathan. Let me be." He swallowed hard. "I never wanted things to end like they did, but seeing you here, pregnant." He paused, his voice catching. "We need to speak in private." The elevator doors slid open with a quiet chime. Lillian stepped inside and, after a tense moment, nodded for him to join her. They stood side by side in the cramped space, the air thick with unspoken regrets. The doors closed, and the slow descent began. Jonathan felt every second drag like a weight on his heart. In that moment, memories flooded him. He thought of the small apartment they once shared. He could almost smell the coffee Lillian brewed each morning while he scribbled business ideas on a notepad. She had so much faith in him back then, cheering him on while he chased success. But in his ambition, he forgot to cherish what they already had. The elevator dinged to a stop at a lower level used by staff. They stepped out into a quiet hallway with storage rooms on either side. Lillian took a shaky breath. "You want to know if you're the father," she said, her voice flat. He nodded, throat tight. "Yes, I need to know." She pressed her lips together. Then she gave him a short, firm reply. "You are." The world seemed to tilt under his feet. He tried to speak, but no words came. A swirl of shame and fear clouded his mind. He glanced at her belly again, the reality of her words crashing over him like a wave. "How long have you known?" he whispered. Lillian's eyes flicked away. "From the day I found out, Jonathan," she said. "I did not tell you because I did not think you cared anymore. After all, you walked away. You have your empire, your new wife, and your big plans." He reached out to touch her hand, but she pulled away. The look in her eyes was one of deep hurt. She walked down the hall, passing rows of stacked chairs and boxes of linens. Jonathan followed in silence, his footsteps echoing behind her. A single light flickered overhead, casting a faint glow on Lillian's face when she turned to him again. "Whatever you think you can do to help, don't. I don't need your pity or your money," she said. "You made your choice a long time ago." Jonathan felt his chest tighten. He wanted to protest, to say he had never stopped caring, but he knew it would sound hollow. He had indeed chosen his business over their marriage. Late nights, broken promises, her tears that he ignored. Now he stood on the other side of those choices. "Lillian," he said softly, "let me at least be responsible. Let me help you in some way." She shook her head. "I'm done living in your shadow, Jonathan. This baby—" She placed a protective hand on her stomach. "This baby will be safe with me. You are not part of our story." Her words cut deep, but Jonathan couldn't blame her. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the ring of a phone shattered the silence. Lillian took a quick look at the caller ID, then turned her back on him. "I have to go," she said, voice tense. "We're short on staff." Without waiting for a reply, she marched toward a door labeled Kitchen, leaving Jonathan standing alone among the stacked boxes. He felt helpless, a feeling he seldom experienced in his world of business deals and social clout. This was a different kind of challenge, personal, raw, and tangled with regret. He leaned against the wall, hands trembling. "I have a child. I'm going to be a father, but she wants nothing to do with me." The thought rattled him. The clang of pots and pans from the next room snapped him out of his daze. He had to return to his own wedding reception, where Maren would be expecting him. Yet, how could he face Maren now, knowing his ex-wife was here, pregnant with his child? His heart pounded. He pressed a hand to his face, trying to compose himself. Moraine cannot find out. Not yet, he told himself. She would be furious. Everything he built, his reputation, his new marriage, could unravel. He had to keep this secret, at least until he sorted out what it meant. But even as the thought passed through his mind, he knew it wasn't right. Hiding Lillian's pregnancy felt like another betrayal. Still, the fear of losing everything gripped him. He was trapped, torn between doing the honest thing and keeping the life he had worked so hard to create. Before heading back upstairs, he whispered to the empty corridor, "I'm sorry, Lillian. I'm so sorry." Then he made his way to the service elevator, shoulders weighted with shame. As the doors closed, he realized that this single night had changed his future forever. Jonathan stepped out into the bustling main floor of his wedding reception, mind spinning with guilt and questions. He had no idea that each choice he made in the coming days would drive him closer to the edge, pushing him to face the true cost of his ambition. Jonathan felt drained as he slipped into the limousine with Moraine later that night, the echoes of the reception still ringing in his ears. Her satin gown rustled against the leather seat as she leaned against him with a satisfied smile. He tried to relax, but his mind would not stop spinning. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lillian's face and heard her words. "You are not part of our story." Moraine let out a contented sigh. "That was an amazing celebration," she said, turning to him with a soft gaze. "Are you happy, Jonathan? You seem quiet." He forced a smile. "I'm just tired. It was a long day." His voice sounded hollow, even to himself. She studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes narrowing. He noticed the faint crinkle of concern at the corner of her brow. "You're sure that's all?" she asked. "No second thoughts?" He shook his head. "Nothing like that," he lied. "I just need some rest." Their apartment, the penthouse suite atop a gleaming tower, felt more like a museum than a home. Everything was pristine and expensive, chosen by an interior designer who specialized in modern luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the glittering city. Moraine went straight to the bedroom to change, while Jonathan found himself standing by the panoramic glass, staring into the night as if it held answers. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He snatched it out, heart pounding at the thought that it might be Lillian, but the screen showed only a work message. He sighed and set the phone aside. Sleep seemed impossible with so many questions swirling in his head. Am I really going to keep Lillian's secret? What kind of father would I be if I pretended this never happened? Moraine emerged in a silk robe, her eyes still full of curiosity. "You sure you're okay?" she asked again, drifting closer. "I can tell something is off." Jonathan kissed her forehead. "I promise, I'm just exhausted. Let's talk in the morning." She searched his face for a moment, then nodded, though an uneasy look lingered in her gaze. Morning brought no relief. Instead, it introduced a heavier sense of dread. Jonathan woke early, tossing on a crisp suit and tie, eager for any distraction. He sped to his office downtown, hoping the familiar world of conference calls and strategy meetings would drown out his racing thoughts. But the moment he sat at his mahogany desk, Lillian's image returned, clouding his focus. He found himself staring blankly at spreadsheets, mind drifting to her words. "I don't need your pity." With a frustrated groan, he pushed back his chair. If he couldn't concentrate, he might as well face his questions head-on. He picked up his phone and called a contact in private security, someone discreet who could gather information without attracting attention. Over the next few days, Jonathan learned more about Lillian's life than he ever intended. She lived in a rundown apartment in the outskirts of town. The landlord was threatening eviction. She worked 2 part-time jobs, including catering. The father of her child was, well, him. The guilt wrapped around him like a chain. "I put her in this position," he thought. "I turned my back and she was left to struggle alone." He tried calling her, but she never picked up. He sent messages, each more desperate than the last, but she gave no reply. Unable to stand by, he secretly paid 2 months of her rent to stop the eviction. It was a small gesture, yet he wondered if Lillian would see it as more interference she had never asked for. Meanwhile, Moren's suspicion grew. She noticed Jonathan's distracted moods, his sudden phone calls at odd hours, the way his eyes seemed far away even when he was in the same room. One evening, she confronted him in the living area, the city lights stretching out behind her like a million glowing questions. "You're hiding something, Jonathan," she said bluntly, folding her arms. "Ever since the wedding, you've been on edge. Are you in trouble at work?" He hesitated, tempted to confess, but fear kept his lips sealed. "It's just business stress," he mumbled. "Things are hectic right now." She studied his face, then turned away. "I wish you'd trust me," she said, her voice tinged with hurt. "Whatever it is, I can handle it." Jonathan said nothing. He wasn't sure if Moren could handle the truth about Lillian and their unborn child. He felt like a coward, but he couldn't see a clear path. Telling Moren would spark a firestorm he wasn't ready to face. A week later, he tried once more to contact Lillian, calling her phone until it went to voicemail. Desperate, he decided to visit her apartment. The building looked even worse in person: peeling paint, broken light fixtures, and a faint odor of stale trash in the hall. He knocked on her door, heart hammering. No answer. He was about to leave when a neighbor, an older woman carrying groceries, passed by. "She's out," the woman said, eyeing him curiously. "Gone to work, I suppose?" Jonathan nodded, thanked her quietly, and turned to go, his shoulders heavy with defeat. Back in his car, he raked his hands through his hair. This wasn't working. If Lillian refused to speak with him, how could he set things right? His phone buzzed. Moren's name flashed on the screen. He stared at it, dread curling in his stomach. He slid his thumb across the glass. "Hello? Where are you?" Her tone was cold and clipped. "We were supposed to have dinner with some of my friends tonight. You're missing." He paused, glancing at his watch. He'd lost track of time. "I'm sorry," he said, starting the engine. "I'll head back now." Silence stretched on the line. Then Moren spoke again, voice low. "We need to talk when you get home." Jonathan arrived at the penthouse and found Moren in the living room, arms crossed. She had a photograph in her hand. His stomach lurched the moment he saw it. There, in glossy print, was a shot of him standing outside Lillian's apartment building, looking stressed. It must have been taken earlier that day. "Who is this woman?" Moren demanded, her voice shaky with anger. "And why are you skulking around her place?" His throat felt tight. He opened his mouth to answer, but no sound came out. Panic flared in his chest. He had never intended for her to discover the truth this way, but now she was staring at him with a mix of hurt and fury. "I want answers," Moren continued, raising her chin. "I deserve to know what's going on, Jonathan. Why are you lying to me?" He looked at the floor, shame burning his cheeks. The perfect facade he built was cracking, and there was nowhere left to hide. Everything he feared was about to come crashing down. Moren held out the photo, her hand trembling. Jonathan realized this was the moment he had been dreading. If he lied again, the damage could be permanent. But could the truth save anything now? Moren held out the photo with shaky fingers, her eyes glistening with both hurt and anger. Jonathan's stomach churned. Every logical part of his mind told him to explain, tell her everything. Yet his fear coiled around his throat, making it hard to speak. "Who is this woman? Why are you at her apartment?" Moren demanded, her voice echoing in the wide living room. She was still wearing the sleek outfit from her dinner with friends, and the severity of her posture, shoulders back, chin high, only emphasized her fury. He swallowed, struggling to find a steady tone. "Her name is Lillian," he said at last. "She's someone I knew before." "Before?" Moren repeated, her lips curling. You look more than casual in this photo. You look worried, concerned. I want the truth." Jonathan could see her composure slipping. He reached for her hand, but she yanked it away, stepping back. His heart twisted. He had tried to shield her from this, but now the moment was unavoidable. "She was my wife," he admitted softly. "We divorced years ago." Moren's eyes widened with shock. "Your ex-wife? You never told me you'd been married before." Her voice shook. "What else are you hiding?" His chest tightened. This was the question he dreaded. What else? He took a breath. She's pregnant." A tremor passed over Morin's face. She seemed to stop breathing. Then she let out a harsh laugh, devoid of any real humor. "Pregnant," she repeated, her voice breaking. "Is it yours?" He looked away, unable to hold her gaze. "Yes." Silence filled the penthouse, stretching unbearably long. Moren set the photo on a nearby table. The city lights sparkled behind her in the floor-to-ceiling windows, a silent contrast to the turmoil inside. Jonathan felt his pulse hammer, waiting for her reaction. "You're telling me that on our wedding day, your pregnant ex-wife showed up as a server?" Morin's jaw tightened. "And you kept it a secret from me?" She squeezed her eyes shut, then opened them, tears threatening to spill. "How could you do this, Jonathan? How could you lie to me like this?" "I didn't know she would be there," he pleaded, voice straining. "I found out the same night you did. I just—" "Stop," she snapped, raising a hand. "Stop talking. I don't want any more lies." Morin turned away, pressing her trembling fingers to her forehead. Jonathan fought the urge to comfort her. He was the reason for her pain, after all. Anything he said might worsen it. "You need to decide," she finally whispered, voice barely audible. "Because I won't stand by while you sneak around with your ex-wife. If you want to be with her and that baby, then go. But don't pretend you can have both of us." His body went cold at the ultimatum. "Morin, I don't want to lose you," he said, stepping forward. "But I can't ignore my child." She drew a shaky breath, wiping her cheeks. "Then fix it," she said, her voice hollow. "Fix it before you destroy everything." The days following that confrontation were a blur of tension. Morin barely spoke to Jonathan, moving through their penthouse like a ghost. She still accompanied him to social events and business dinners, but only because appearances mattered to her. Underneath the polished exterior, resentment festered. Unbeknownst to Jonathan, Morin hired a private investigator to gather every piece of dirt she could find. She felt humiliated and betrayed, determined to protect herself in case Jonathan chose to leave her for Lillian. One by one, Morin's close social connections heard rumors. Rumors carefully planted by Morin, all suggesting that Jonathan was unfaithful, dishonest, and untrustworthy. These whispers spread quickly among his business associates. At first, Jonathan didn't notice. He was too distracted by Lillian's refusal to speak with him. But then, a major client abruptly pulled out of a lucrative deal. Another canceled a contract at the last minute. Investors began to dodge his calls. Jonathan sat in his office one afternoon, brow furrowed, staring at the slew of polite rejections that cluttered his email. His assistant, Brittany, slipped into the room, her expression uneasy. "Sir," she said softly, "I just heard from the Garrison Group. They're suspending negotiations on the new contract." His gut twisted. "Suspending? Why?" Brittany hesitated. "They didn't give a clear reason, but I heard rumors that you might be dealing with a personal scandal. They don't want to be associated with negative press." He felt his throat tighten. "Thank you for letting me know." She nodded and left, closing the door behind her. Jonathan stared out the window at the bustling city below. Morin must be behind this. The thought made him feel sick, but he was too tired for anger. He had dug this pit himself by hiding the truth, and now he was sinking deeper each day. While his business troubles piled up, Jonathan received a terse call from the landlord of Lillian's apartment. The man spoke in a bored tone, as if this were routine. "She's behind again. I don't know who paid her rent last time, but if it's late again, she's out." Fear jabbed at Jonathan's chest. He couldn't stand the thought of Lillian being homeless, especially now that she was so far along in her pregnancy. He decided to confront her once more, even though she kept rejecting his calls. That evening, he drove out to the worn-down building. The sun was setting, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. He knocked on Lillian's door, half expecting her not to answer. But after a tense moment, the door creaked open. Lillian's expression was guarded. She looked thinner, dark circles under her eyes. Jonathan felt a pang of concern. She stepped aside, allowing him in. The apartment was small and sparse, boxes stacked in a corner. A single lamp cast a dim glow over a plain couch. "What do you want?" she asked, crossing her arms over her chest. He glanced at her belly, then back to her face. "I heard about the eviction threat," he said. "Let me help." She let out a bitter laugh. "Help? Like last time, when you paid the rent in secret? I knew it was you." Jonathan's cheeks burned. "I couldn't let you lose your place. You need somewhere safe for yourself and the baby." Her voice shook with anger. "Safe? You talk about safe, but you are the one who left me when I needed you. Now you suddenly care?" He deserved that. He lowered his gaze. "I know I messed up," he murmured, "but I'm here now. I can give you money. Make sure you have everything you need." "No," she cut in sharply. "Money isn't what I need from you. I needed a partner. I needed someone who wouldn't vanish the moment success was within reach. But you're too late, Jonathan." A heavy silence followed. He scanned the small living area, noticing a baby crib in pieces on the floor, as if she had tried to assemble it and given up. An empty carton of takeout sat on the coffee table. The overhead light flickered. "I just want to do the right thing," he said, voice trembling. "Let me at least cover the rent again. Please." Lillian squeezed her eyes shut. "If you insist," she said at last, "I won't stop you. But don't think that means I'm letting you back into my life. I can't trust you, Jonathan. Not after everything." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The ache in her voice cut deeper than any insult. He wondered if there was a path to earn her trust again, or if their bond was gone forever. When Jonathan got home, Moran was waiting with a glass of wine in hand. She sat on the couch, one leg crossed over the other, looking more like a lawyer preparing for trial than a loving spouse. As soon as he stepped inside, she fixed him with a glare. "Where were you?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. He shut the door behind him. "I went to see Lillian." "Of course you did." Moran exhaled, setting her glass aside. "Well, in case you're curious, 3 more clients dropped us today, and I got a few interesting calls from people wondering if our marriage is a sham." He rubbed his temples, a dull headache growing. "Moran, I never wanted this to spill into our public life." She stood abruptly. "Maybe not, but you're naive if you think you can hide something so big forever. People talk, and I'm not going to stand here and defend you while you chase after your ex-wife and her baby." Jonathan flinched at the venom in her words. "I'm not chasing after her. I'm trying to fix what I broke." Moran laughed, but it was a humorless sound. "Fix? You think you can fix this? You're going to lose everything if you keep pushing me aside. Your business is in trouble, your reputation is in tatters, and I'm on the verge of walking out that door." He stood there, feeling stuck between the wreckage of 2 worlds. If he chose Moran, he would abandon Lillian and his unborn child, a choice that made his stomach turn with guilt. If he stood by Lillian, he risked losing everything else. He thought of the unborn baby, fragile and innocent. Could he really leave that child without a father? "I can't just walk away from my responsibility," he said, voice trembling with emotion. "I made mistakes, but I won't repeat them." Moren's lip trembled as she gazed at him, a mix of anger and sorrow in her eyes. "So, that's it," she said quietly. "You're choosing her." He shook his head. "I'm not choosing her over you. I'm choosing to be a father. That doesn't mean I don't love you." She looked away, tears gathering in her eyes. "I wish I could believe that," she murmured. "But right now, I feel like I'm second place in your life." Over the next week, Jonathan witnessed the fallout of Moren's anger. She began spreading her version of events to influential contacts, painting him as a man who abandons commitments. One by one, high-profile investors and clients ghosted him. Business deals he had spent months cultivating evaporated overnight. He tried to repair the damage, reaching out to reassure old partners, but the rumor mill was merciless. Some believed he was embroiled in a messy scandal with multiple women. Others decided they didn't want to risk the negative publicity. Jonathan's staff reported plummeting confidence in his leadership. He found himself fighting a war on two fronts. At home, Moren barely spoke to him, except to hurl accusations of betrayal. At the office, his team scrambled to keep the company afloat. And in the background, Lillian still refused any genuine contact, except for allowing him to pay her rent. Jonathan didn't know how much longer he could handle it. Anxiety gnawed at him every moment. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford. In rare, quiet moments, he imagined holding his future child, teaching them to walk, maybe showing them a better path in life. But those dreams felt like they were drifting out of reach. After another chaotic day at the office, Jonathan drove to Lillian's building. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her landlord had mentioned she was behind on utilities, and a neighbor said she'd been looking ill. Worry spurred him forward. He knocked on the door, calling her name. No response. He knocked harder, desperation rising in his chest. He was about to leave when the door opened. Lillian stood there, pale and shaky. "What do you want?" she asked, voice weak. He stepped closer, noticing her trembling hands. "Lillian, you look unwell. Have you seen a doctor?" She tried to brush him off. "I'm fine." But her knees buckled, forcing Jonathan to catch her around the shoulders before she could fall. Alarm shot through him. He helped her to the couch, adrenaline pounding in his ears. "Stay put," he ordered gently, fetching a glass of water. "When was the last time you ate?" She let out a shaky laugh. "I don't remember. I've been working 2 jobs, trying to—" She stopped, her voice breaking. He felt a surge of guilt for not pushing harder to help her sooner. "Let me call your doctor," he said, "or I can take you to the hospital." She gripped his arm, eyes shimmering with tears. "You think everything can be solved by rushing me to a hospital or throwing money around? That's not what I need, Jonathan." He swallowed, rubbing his chest as if to ease the tightness there. "Then tell me what you need." She gazed at him, raw pain in her eyes. "I don't know," she whispered. "I'm scared." Her admission hit him like a punch. Lillian was the strongest woman he had ever known. She never admitted fear lightly. For a moment he saw a flicker of the closeness they once shared. His heart pounded with a strange mix of hope and desperation. "Let me be here for you," he said, voice almost pleading. "Not just with money, but with actual support. I can take you to appointments, help prepare for the baby." She looked away. "And what happens after that? You leave again the moment your empire calls?" Her tone was bitter, but beneath it lay the vulnerability of someone who had been hurt too many times. His hands trembled. "I won't leave," he promised. "I've learned my lesson." But as the words left his mouth, he wondered if that was true. The pull of his collapsing business, the tension with Moren, the years of old habits. Could he truly change? Lillian pushed his hand aside, managing to stand. "You say that now," she said, her voice low. "Yet every time I let myself believe in you, you choose your ambitions over me, over us." A tear slid down her cheek. She wiped it away, holding his gaze in a silent challenge. Then, without warning, She turned and walked to the door. She pulled it open, the hinges squeaking. "Go," she said simply, her eyes filled with a sorrow that cut deeper than anger. "I can't talk about this anymore." Jonathan's heart twisted. He wanted to argue, to hold her, to promise everything would be okay, but the exhaustion etched in her face told him there was nothing more to say. So he stepped outside, each footstep heavier than the last. She shut the door behind him, the latch clicking with finality. He stood in the dim hallway, staring at the worn paint on the wall, feeling more lost than ever. "I just want to do the right thing," he told himself, yet it seemed every path led to more pain. The sound of Lillian's door locking echoed in Jonathan's mind. Outside, a cold draft swept the corridor. He realized that the next choice he made would not only affect Lillian and their unborn child, but also determine the fate of his business and marriage. Yet, no matter which way he turned, it felt as though the ground was crumbling beneath him. Jonathan leaned against the marble counter in his penthouse kitchen, staring at his phone as if it might deliver a miracle. The screen remained blank. Lillian had cut him off again. No calls, no messages. The last words she'd spoken, "Go." "I can't talk about this anymore," replayed in his mind on a loop. Outside the windows, dawn light colored the city skyline in pale pink and gold. He could hear Morin moving about in the bedroom, the soft thud of drawers opening and closing. Normally, these quiet morning sounds brought him a sense of routine or comfort, but nothing felt normal now. He had spent another sleepless night haunted by guilt, regrets, and the sinking feeling that every part of his life was unraveling. He wanted to check on Lillian again, just to be sure she was okay, but a wave of shame stopped him. Each encounter seemed to end with her slamming a door in his face. Maybe the best thing was to respect her space, yet the image of her trembling in that run-down apartment gnawed at him. "I can't keep doing nothing." A faint click made him turn. Morin entered the kitchen, her robe pulled tight around her waist. Heavy circles darkened her eyes, a silent testament that she had also slept poorly. They stood in tense silence, like two strangers sharing a room. Finally, she cleared her throat. "I have a lunch meeting with some investors later," she said in a subdued voice. "I'm trying to salvage your reputation, Jonathan. Our reputation." He swallowed hard. "Thank you," he managed, though the words felt insufficient. He knew how this looked from her perspective. She was fighting to keep his business afloat while he ran around after his ex-wife. She gave a small nod, then opened the fridge to pull out a bottle of water. "I meant what I said," she continued, not turning around. "Fix this, or—" Her voice trailed off, but the threat lingered in the quiet. He caught sight of her reflection in the stainless steel fridge door, lips pressed thin, eyes glimmering with unshed tears. This was not the strong, confident woman he had married. This was someone bracing for heartbreak. And I did this to her, he thought, stomach twisting. Later that day, he found himself making phone calls to an old friend in property management. If Lillian wouldn't accept his money openly, maybe he could help her in secret. He arranged for a better apartment in a safer neighborhood. The manager agreed to keep Jonathan's name out of it, as long as the rent arrived on time. Next, he ordered items for the baby: diapers, clothes, even a folding crib that wouldn't take much space. He had them delivered anonymously. His heart pounded with each purchase, torn between relief at helping and the sting of knowing she might reject these gifts. When he received notification that the apartment was ready, he debated whether to tell her. She might slam the door on me again, he thought. But a faint hope flickered. If Lillian realized there was a secure place waiting for her, maybe she'd see he was sincere. That evening, after Morin left for her own meeting, Jonathan drove to Lillian's building. The stale odor in the hallway felt familiar now, a constant reminder of his failings. He knocked softly. This time, after a short wait, she opened the door. The small living room behind her was dimly lit by a single lamp. She eyed him warily. What do you want?" He mustered a steady voice. "I found a better apartment for you," he said. "Safer neighborhood, close to a clinic. Rent is covered for 6 months, no strings attached." Her brows knit together. "No strings," she echoed, doubt coloring her tone. "You think I'm some charity case?" He flinched. "I'm trying to help." She exhaled sharply. "And you think you can solve everything by buying me a new place?" She looked around at the peeling walls, the box of baby supplies he had already sent, the battered furniture. "I've managed this far without you." He stepped back, hands raised in surrender. "I know, you're strong, but you shouldn't have to fight alone, especially now. Let me ease some of the burdens." He hesitated, voice trembling with sincerity. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. Just consider moving somewhere safer for the baby's sake." She studied his face in silence, searching for hidden motives. After a tense pause, she nodded, though her eyes remained hard. "I'll look at it," she said, "but don't think this changes anything between us." A flicker of relief touched his chest. "That's all I ask," he murmured. "Thank you." He told her the address and details, then stepped away, sensing she might end the conversation at any moment. She surprised him by asking softly, "Why now, Jonathan? Why do all this after leaving me behind?" He swallowed. "Because I can't undo the past, but I can try to do better now." She said nothing more, gently closing the door. It wasn't exactly a warm embrace, but it felt like the slightest crack in her defenses. The following week, Jonathan found himself in a high-pressure meeting at his office, trying to salvage another major contract. His phone buzzed mid-presentation. Normally, he'd ignore personal calls, but something told him to check. When he glanced at the screen, his blood ran cold. An unknown number displayed, followed by a message. "Lillian is in labor. She's at Memorial General Hospital." He froze, pulse thudding in his ears. Forgetting the entire meeting, he bolted for the door, leaving his colleagues gaping. Speeding through midday traffic, he gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. "Am I too late? Is she okay?" He sprinted through the hospital entrance, scanning signs until he found the maternity ward. A nurse directed him to a small waiting area outside the delivery rooms. Adrenaline surged through him, every second feeling like a lifetime. He realized with a jolt that he might become a father at any moment. Time blurred. After what felt like hours, a nurse emerged, guiding him into the corridor. Lillian's muffled cries reached him from a nearby room. He hesitated, dread tangling with concern. Would she even want him there? Before he could decide, the door to the delivery room cracked open. Another nurse peered out, eyes narrowing. "Are you family?" she asked. "Yes, He struggled for words. "I'm the father." The nurse gave a brisk nod. "She's in active labor. We'll allow you inside if it's okay with her." Jonathan stepped in, heart hammering. The stark white lights illuminated Lillian, propped against pillows, face contorted in pain. Sweat slicked her brow. She caught sight of him, and for an instant her gaze softened. "You came," she whispered, voice tight with effort. He moved to her side, feeling clumsy and out of place among the monitors and medical staff. "I'm here," he said, gently taking her hand. She didn't pull away, which felt like a small miracle. He murmured words of comfort he wasn't sure he believed, but needed to say. Lillian's contractions intensified, and she cried out, fingers digging into his arm. Jonathan's stomach churned. Seeing her in pain tore him apart, and a wave of guilt washed over him. If he had been by her side from the start, would she have been less alone? Hours passed in a haze of labored breathing and urgent doctor's instructions. Finally, a shrill cry pierced the air. Jonathan's eyes flooded with tears before he even realized what was happening. A tiny baby emerged, lungs wailing, arms flailing for the first time. A nurse quickly checked the newborn, then handed her to Lillian. She was so small, wrapped in a pale pink blanket. Lillian stared at the baby, her expression wavering between awe and exhaustion. Jonathan couldn't breathe. His daughter. Their daughter. He reached out hesitantly, brushing his fingertips along the baby's soft cheek. Emotion clogged his throat. "She's perfect," he whispered. Lillian closed her eyes, pressing a trembling kiss to the baby's forehead. Then she looked up at Jonathan, tears glistening. "I thank you for being here." A lump formed in his throat. "I wouldn't be anywhere else," he said hoarsely. For a moment, everything felt right, like they were a family, bonded by this tiny life in Lillian's arms. But the harsh reality crept in. Was this a fleeting peace, or a new beginning? Over the next few days, Jonathan visited the hospital as often as he could. Moren, however, was silent. He had sent her a brief text explaining the situation, but she never replied. At work, more deals fell through. It felt like the walls were closing in from every angle. Yet he couldn't tear himself away from his newborn daughter, Amara. He cradled her one afternoon, watching as Lillian slept in the hospital bed. The baby's wide eyes seemed to study him, her tiny fingers grasping his thumb. In that quiet moment, he understood a depth of love he had never felt. Everything else, money, status, success, dimmed next to this miracle of new life. When Lillian awoke, she looked at him with guarded eyes. He saw the conflict written on her face. "I'm letting you see her now," she said softly, "because I want her to know her father. But that doesn't mean I trust you again." He swallowed, heart heavy. "I know." Her gaze flicked to Amara, then back to him. "You have 1 month," she continued, her tone firm despite the tiredness in her eyes. 1 month to show me you can be the father she deserves. If you can't—" She paused, taking a breath. "Then I'll make sure you're not part of her life." He blinked, stunned. What does that mean exactly? She looked away, stroking the baby's cheek. "It means you prove you've changed. Not with money, not with fancy apartments, but with your actions. Be here day after day. Show me you care more about this child than your ambition. Show me you can stay." Jonathan's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, tell her he was committed, that he had already made sacrifices. But he realized words were worthless at this point. She needed to see it, not hear it. He nodded, voice solemn. "I accept. 1 month." She tilted her head. 1 month, she repeated quietly. "After that, if I see the same man who left me behind, then Amara and I will disappear. I won't let her get hurt." A cold dread settled over him. He brushed a tender hand over Amara's soft hair, the baby shifting with a small yawn. "I understand," he said, eyes locked on Lillian's. In that moment, he grasped just how high the stakes were. Not only was his business crumbling, but now his chance to be a father hung by a thread. He turned Amara in his arms gently, heart clenching at the sight of her delicate features. He couldn't lose her, not now that he knew what love like this felt like. Jonathan felt the weight of Lillian's ultimatum as he left the hospital that evening. The city lights glittered far below, indifferent to his turmoil. He had 30 days to prove himself, or risk losing his daughter forever. Yet with every passing hour, the fallout from Moren's anger and his failing business threatened to tear him in half. Jonathan stood outside the hospital doors, cold air brushing his face. Everything felt surreal. He had a newborn daughter named Amara and a 1-month deadline to prove he could be the father she deserved. For a long moment he simply stared at the glow of the streetlights. Then he headed to his car, determination warring with fear in his chest. The very next morning, he decided his first step would be to show Lillian that Amara would never lack comfort. He purchased top-of-the-line baby gear, strollers, car seats, anything he believed might ease Lillian's burdens. He even opened a trust fund in Amara's name, depositing a large sum of money. When he showed up at Lillian's new apartment, which he had arranged for her to move into from the hospital, he found her cradling Amara in her arms. Carefully, he unloaded boxes of baby items in the small living room. Lillian watched with tense eyes. "Look," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, "I just want her to have everything she needs." Lillian set Amara down in a bassinet and turned to him, arms crossed. "So, you think you can buy your way into her life?" she asked, a tired edge in her voice. He started to protest, but she shook her head. "Money doesn't replace actual care, Jonathan. She needs you present, not just your credit card." Her words stung more than he expected. He opened his mouth, then closed it. She's right, he thought, shame creeping in. Without another word, he packed up most of the items and left, feeling like a failure before he had truly begun. Undeterred, Jonathan tried a new approach. He offered to handle every little task for Lillian and Amara: doctor appointments, scheduling feedings, making sure they had the right baby formula. He showed up early, armed with timetables and charts, determined to prove he was the perfect father figure. Yet, as he moved around the apartment, dictating a feeding schedule, Lillian's frustration grew clear. "She's not a business project," she said, her voice tense. "You can't manage her like one of your deals. Babies have their own needs. Sometimes they're hungry at random times. Sometimes they just cry. That's how it is." He frowned, flipping through his notes. "But structure can help. If we follow these guidelines—" She snatched the paper from his hand, tossing it on a nearby table. "Guidelines don't matter if you're not here emotionally. She needs your love, not a strict plan." Jonathan felt a sting of hurt and confusion. In business, organization had always been his key to success. Now, that skill seemed useless. He stared at the scattered notes, a flush of embarrassment warming his face. "All right," he murmured, voice subdued. "I'm sorry. I'm just trying to do this right." She breathed out, her anger easing. "I know. But let her be a baby, okay?" She picked Amara up, pressing a light kiss to the infant's forehead. "She's not a checklist." Uncertain how to fix his mistakes, Jonathan turned to other people for help. He invited a respected pediatrician he knew, through a friend, to visit Lillian and confirm that Amara was healthy. He also arranged for an old college buddy, now a father of two, to drop by and offer parenting tips. In his mind, experts vouching for him might show Lillian he was serious. But the moment these visitors arrived at Lillian's apartment, she looked betrayed. She pulled Jonathan aside, voice hushed but heated. "Why are you parading strangers through my home? You think their approval makes you a better father?" He shook his head, flustered. "I only wanted them to guide us, to reassure you that I'm doing everything I can." Her eyes flashed. "I don't need reassurance from outsiders," she snapped. "I need to see it from you. You're still relying on external solutions instead of facing me, facing us." A wave of failure washed over him. It seemed every idea he had turned out to be the wrong approach. The visitors left awkwardly, and Jonathan stood alone in the apartment, feeling more lost than ever. All the while, Moren's silent rage boiled over in the background. One evening, Jonathan arrived at the penthouse to find her pacing the living room, phone in hand. She glared at him as he walked in. "Do you have any idea how this looks?" she snapped, tossing her phone onto a sleek side table. "Your ex-wife just had your baby. You vanish at all hours. My friends keep asking if our marriage is some twisted arrangement." He let out a weary sigh. "I won't apologize for caring for my child." She scoffed. "Your child." "Right. And what about me, Jonathan? Am I supposed to smile and pretend everything's fine?" He closed his eyes, heart heavy. "I never wanted to hurt you." She stared at him, tears forming. "Well, you did," she said softly, voice trembling. "I've stood by you, helped build your image, your business, and now you're throwing it all away." He tried to speak, but she held up a hand. No more. I'm done trying to save your reputation. If you want to destroy yourself, fine. But don't expect me to shield you from the consequences." In the days that followed, Morin cut off most communication. Rumors about Jonathan's failing business spread further. Key partners withdrew funding. Staff morale plummeted. He realized he was on the brink of financial ruin. Yet each morning he still went to Lillian's apartment, attempting to keep his promise of showing up for Amara. Lillian's health took a turn one chilly afternoon. Jonathan arrived to find her pale and weak, stumbling when she tried to answer the door. Alarmed, he helped her to the couch. "You need a doctor," he said firmly. She tried to protest, but then Amara began fussing in the crib, sensing the tension. Lillian sank back, pressing a hand to her forehead. "I just need rest," she insisted weakly. It was clear she couldn't manage on her own. Jonathan took charge, changing Amara's diapers, preparing formula, and rocking the baby to sleep when she cried. Lillian drifted in and out of a feverish doze. Night fell, and Jonathan found himself kneeling by the crib, patting Amara's back as she let out tiny whimpers. The overhead light hummed quietly. With one hand on the baby, he glanced at the clock. He was supposed to have an urgent online meeting with a potential investor in 30 minutes, a meeting that might save his business. He looked back at Lillian, lying half-conscious on the couch, and then at Amara's wide, teary eyes. His stomach twisted. What matters more? The answer came before the question even finished. When the meeting time arrived, he silenced his phone. If he stepped away now, who would care for Amara? For hours he paced the small apartment, soothing the baby, checking on Lillian. Only once she finally fell into a deeper sleep did he glance at his missed notifications. The potential investor had left a terse message. Opportunity lost. We're moving on. Jonathan swallowed the lump in his throat. By morning, Lillian's fever had broken. She stirred to find Jonathan seated on the floor beside the couch, Amara asleep against his chest. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. "You stayed," she said in a raspy whisper. He managed a tired smile. "I couldn't leave you like this. Neither of you." For a moment, she just watched him. Then a flicker of emotion crossed her face. Was it gratitude or relief? He wasn't sure, but it felt significant. Maybe she sees now that I'm here to stay. Yet the cost had been high. He had lost a vital deal, and his company was closer to collapse than ever. He didn't bring it up, though. Instead, he rose gently, careful not to wake Amara. He laid the baby in her crib, checked Lillian's temperature, and then made her some tea. Simple, human gestures that required no money or outside validation. All the while, he felt a new sense of purpose, a strange peace even in the midst of chaos. Jonathan walked to the apartment window and gazed at the early morning sky. He had failed to save the business deal that night, but in doing so, he had passed a more important test, choosing to care for his child and for Lillian above his own ambition. The question was, would Lillian see this as the proof she demanded? Or would the inevitable fallout from his professional world still rip them apart? Jonathan left Lillian's apartment the next morning with a heavy sense of uncertainty. She was recovering, and Amara dozed peacefully in her crib. But the month-long deadline still loomed, and he had only a few days left to prove himself. The memory of choosing to stay with them instead of saving his business deal weighed on his mind. I failed at work, he thought, yet maybe I did the right thing. Returning to his penthouse, he found Morin seated at the dining table, going through files. She barely looked up as he entered, but the stack of papers told him all he needed to know. She was finalizing her exit. At last, she closed a folder and spoke. "I'm leaving," she said quietly, pressing her lips tight. "I've done everything I could to salvage your image, but it's clear you've made your choice." Jonathan's chest tightened. He couldn't deny her words. "I'm sorry," he said, voice thick. "I never wanted to hurt you." She rose from the table, meeting his gaze with watery eyes. "I loved you, Jonathan, but I can't compete with a child, and honestly, I don't want to." She paused, wiping a stray tear. "Good luck. You'll need it." He let out a trembling breath as she walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing across the marble floor. Part of him wanted to beg her to stay, to fix what they had built together, but the larger part knew it was over. 2 days later, Jonathan received a call from a surprising source, a former business partner he'd parted ways with amicably a year ago. The man had heard the rumors but believed Jonathan still had integrity. He offered a smaller-scale investment, enough to keep the company afloat. It wasn't the grand empire Jonathan once ran, but it was a fresh start, one that required sincerity and honest work. Jonathan accepted the lifeline, feeling a surge of relief. Perhaps he could rebuild, one step at a time, without sacrificing what mattered most. On the final day of the month, Jonathan arrived at Lillian's apartment carrying only himself. No gifts, no grand gestures. He found her sitting on the couch with Amara in her arms, the baby cooing softly. Lillian looked at him carefully. "So," she said, voice guarded, "did you realize fatherhood can't be solved by money or management plans?" He nodded, kneeling in front of her so he could see Amara's tiny face. "I did, and I'm still learning, but I'm here." He swallowed hard. "I missed an important business meeting to stay with you and Amara. I lost contracts. Moren left me. But I have no regrets about that night. I chose our daughter, and you, over my work." Her expression shifted, and for the first time, Jonathan saw something like acceptance in her eyes. She gently handed Amara to him. As he held his daughter, warmth spread through him, dispelling the months of guilt and uncertainty. "I see you've changed," Lillian said, voice soft. "So, stay." 3 months later, Jonathan stood in a small park under a blooming arch of wildflowers. Lillian wore a simple dress, Amara in her arms. A few close friends gathered around, and this was no grand wedding with chandeliers or gold trim, just honest vows spoken under the open sky. When he slipped a ring onto Lillian's finger, Jonathan felt tears burn at the corners of his eyes. "I promise," he whispered, "to never lose sight of what truly matters again." Lillian smiled, her free hand resting lightly on his. "I believe you." In the distance, Amara giggled, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and new beginnings. Their journey had been stormy, but in the hush of that simple ceremony Jonathan realized a truth. Love, when fought for and nurtured, could blossom in the most unlikely places. He looked at Lillian and Amara, heart full, knowing that this time he wouldn't let ambition steal away what mattered most. What would you sacrifice for the people you love? Sometimes life's greatest lessons come wrapped in our most painful mistakes. Remember, second chances aren't guaranteed. They must be earned through actions, not words. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of love to break down walls and bridge any divide. Please do comment your feedback and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of family, redemption, and the triumph of love over pride. Remember, it's never too late to change your story.